Yuya wasn't sure how long it took for him to finally get his wind and energy back, but it felt like a long time. He couldn't remember the last time he had been through so much physical exertion. Every bit of him ached, and he was having ghost pains from his scars, which had been stretched and irritated from all of the running and getting dragged around. He thought he might have heard Crow talking to their rescuers, but he was so tired that it was all he could do to listen to the sound of his heart in his ears. He might have dozed off once or twice against Crow, who didn't let go of him for even a moment. It felt comforting. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so safe. When he finally got all his senses back, the wagon had stopped. Yuya blinked a few times, trying to get his vision to return. Crow shifted his hands down to Yuya's shoulders. "You doing okay?" he said. I think so," Yuya said. He coughed once. Breathing too deeply was still hard. Crow winced sympathetically. Crow had already washed off his own makeup so that the scars were visible on his face again. He frowned, rubbing at the remnants of Yuya's makeup with his thumb. Crow must have washed most of it off of him while he slept. "You shouldn't have been pushing yourself so hard," he said. "You think you're going to be okay?" I could use some water," Yuya said quietly, his voice feeling hoarse. Crow shifted Yuya carefully to a sitting position, then fumbled at his belt for his canteen. Yuya gratefully pulled it to his lips and drank a few small gulps. He really wanted more, but he didn't want to impose by drinking too much. He tried to hand it back, but Crow pushed it back at him. "You don't have to hold back, okay? Drink as much as you need." "But this is your canteen." "We stopped near a river. I can refill it. Please, Yuya, drink. Aki will have my head if you don't take care of yourself." Yuya flushed, but he obediently went back to drinking, almost finishing the entire canteen. Crow only took it back then, sitting up against the back of the wagon with a groan. Yuya realized that he must have been awfully cramped holding Yuya all that time, and he ducked back. "Where are we?" he said. "And who are they?" He didn't see the man with the glasses, or the other two, anywhere. He looked around the wagon. It didn't really have all that much in it, just a few crates and a pile of bags in one corner. He couldn't see a horse hooked to the front through the front arch, either. He peeked through the back, but all he could see were the meadows stretching out. "We're already over a quarter of the way to the old woods," Crow said. "That horse of theirs is something of a monster." Yuya bit his lip. "I don't like this," Yuri said. "It seems dangerous. We should go." "Go where?" Yuto said. "We are in no condition to run anywhere. We have to trust Crow." "If those guys wanted to hurt us, they would have done it already, right?" said Yugo. "They did help us." "But for what purpose?" Yuri said, his voice icy. "I don't know," Yuya thought. He was a little nervous about that, too. "Who are they?" he said again. Crow let out a huff, his hand running through his hair. "They're a bit of a tight-lipped bunch," he said. "But as much as I hate it, they are helping us quite a bit. They knew who you were and what we were doing. Reiji said he would help us get to Kokoro." "Reiji," Yuya repeated, testing the sound of the name. He wasn't sure what nationality it was himself, but Yuri indicated to him with exasperation that it was the most popular name in Shizenrei. Didn't he pay attention to anything that Yuri taught him? And they had already known what his and Crow's plan was? Crow squeezed Yuya's shoulder lightly. Then he stood up, making the wagon creak slightly with his weight. "Wait here," he said. "I'll go see about refilling our water supplies, and seeing what our mystery friends are up to." "I can come too," Yuya said, trying to sit up too. "You need to rest," Crow said. "Just a little longer, okay? I'll be right back." He ruffled Yuya's hair lightly with a smile. Then he hopped down from the wagon, making it clatter a bit underneath Yuya. Yuya watched him disappear around the corner of the wagon. For a few minutes he did what he was told, sitting with his hands in his lap and just staring down at his palms. He felt better. There was a breeze stirring through the covered wagon, ruffling his hair and the hem of his tunic. His clothes felt light and a bit scratchy against his skin, and his ears and neck felt incredibly light without the weight of jewelry hanging from it. He sucked in a huge breath and let it out, just enjoying the feeling of the open air in his lungs. He couldn't smell any smoke or incense for the first time he could remember. Nothing but the cool autumn air and the faint tang of grass in his nostrils, along with something that must be flowers, but it was so different from the few blossoms Dennis had brought for him that he wasn't sure what they were. He could hear something like insects buzzing out in the grass, and besides that, the world was completely quiet. He didn't even hear any destructive thoughts. It was a wild guess to know how long it had been since he hadn't been able to hear a single thought. His head felt blissfully silent. After a few beats, though, the canvas hanging over his head, closing him into the wagon, started to feel a bit oppressive. He forced himself to stay where he was for another minute and a half. Crow had asked him to stay where he was. "We don't have to do what he says," Yuri said. "He doesn't own us." Yuri had a point. Yuya struggled for just another minute, wringing his hands in his lap. He wanted to go out into the meadow and stand in the grass and stare out at the horizon, not just from inside the cart. But he also felt like he should do what he was told, old wounds skittering with memories of what had happened when he hadn't. "I don't think Crow will be mad," Yuto said. "He doesn't seem like that kind of person." That was true, too. Yuya didn't know him all that well still, but Crow seemed like he really didn't want to hurt Yuya at all, so maybe it would be okay. Finally, his curiosity won out. Yuya crawled to the end of the wagon, swung his legs over the side, and landed lightly in the grass. He walked around the wagon, and the world opened up to him. He could see vast swaths of grass, stretching out for miles. He couldn't even see the city anymore. There was no sign that humans even existed out here, just the grass swishing in the wind. Was this what an ocean looked like, only with water instead of grass? For once, the voices in his head fell silent too, and he wondered if they were just as awed as he was. He thought he heard Yuri gasp, but maybe that was his own intake of breath. "Do you like the view?" The voice was so soft that for just a second, Yuya thought it was the wind. When it finally hit him that it was a person and not Crow, he jumped, whirling. The man with the glasses held up his hands at Yuya's pale face. "My apologies," he said. "I did not intend to frighten you." Yuya's heart slowed after a few beats, but he kept his distance, his eyes fixed on every tiny motion the man made. Or perhaps not a man. Now that Yuya wasn't dizzy with exertion, he could see that this person was barely older than Yuya was. He had a youthful face that pinched at the edges of his eyes, as though he had had to grow up far too quickly and his body smarted from it. This one was Reiji, right? You're Reiji?" Yuya said. Reiji inclined his head. "I see you caught my name already," he said. "Yes, that would be me." He was much taller than Yuya, but seemed almost as bony. His red scarf hung in thick swaths over his shoulders. It seemed far too warm for even the autumn air. Yuya himself had shed his cloak sometime in the haze of travel. His eyes, too. They were intense. Yuya felt somehow smaller than he already was under his quiet violet gaze. "I'm Yuya," he said. Reiji nodded briefly. "It is a pleasure to finally learn your name," he said. "I've heard much of you, but never a name." Yuya bit his lip, remembering what Crow had said. Reiji and his companions knew who Yuya was. Why, then, had they come to their aid? Yuya opened his mouth to ask, but his was cut off by a voice as the boy with the lute loomed around the wagon. "Oi, Reiji, should I be getting Armageddon hooked up yet?" "Don't touch my horse, Sawatari," was all Reiji said in response, without even looking at him. The boy's eyes fell on Yuya then. For just a moment he stared blankly, and then his face lit up. He rounded the wagon and hopped over to the pair of them, looking as excited as if he had just found his favorite thing that he had lost. He was only a hair taller than Yuya, with the same tone of skin as his own, only with a rounder face and gray eyes. His blonde bangs swooped down over and between his eyes, fading into the clipped brown color behind it. "Ah, our little runaway prince has awoken," he said, grabbing Yuya's hand and shaking it wildly. Shingo Sawatari, the greatest tail spinner in the Four Kingdoms and beyond. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Yuya shook on the end of Sawatari's hand, feeling like he was being flapped up and down from the ferocity of the handshake. I pleased to meet you too, Yuya said. He had never met anyone who was excited to see him. Don't encourage him, Reiji said, and for a moment Yuya thought Reiji was talking about him. But Sawatari pouted at Reiji as he released Yuya's hand. For shame, Reiji, you do me a disservice. To not encourage me is to discourage art itself. He is more talk than he is action, Yuya. Don't mind him, Reiji said, but there was the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. Sawatari blustered a bit more, using a lot of words and in fact a few languages that Yuya didn't understand in rapid succession, before the third member of the party walked around the wagon with Crow in tow. Crow stopped mid-sentence to the other young man as his eyes grazed across Yuya. He took the rest of the distance in just 2 big strides, moving himself in between Yuya and the other two. Yuya flinched briefly at the sudden motion, but Crow was busy looking at the other 3. Don't overwhelm him, Crow said. Sawatari looked offended, but Reiji just inclined his head. My apologies, he said, and this time Yuya caught just the barest hint of an accent under his otherwise monotone voice. So your friend doesn't seem like he wants to use his voice. Are we going to get any explanation of who you all are, and why we should trust you? The friend that Crow was speaking of, the third member of the party, simply blinked impassively. He was almost as tall as Reiji, his face half covered by a blue scarf, and his dark blue hair gathered into a ponytail. He had alert, attentive eyes, but beyond that it was nearly impossible to tell what expression he was making. Seeing as Tsukikage cannot speak, that would explain why he doesn't answer you, Reiji said. Crow blinked, his mouth freezing half open. Yuya's eyes flickered toward Tsukikage. He couldn't talk? Tsukikage met Yuya's eyes silently. Then he looked back at Reiji and made some quick sign with his hands. Reiji nodded as though that meant something. We should get moving again, he said. I will be happy to answer any and all of your questions on the road, but I don't like being out in the open like this. Crow hesitated. Yuya reached for his shirt then, tugging on it briefly. His heart jumped when Crow looked down at him, and he looked at the ground. I think they're all right, he said. I think we can trust them. He didn't hear a single angry or destructive thought from any of them, at least, not at the moment. He had heard Reiji think about how much he wanted to kill the priests, but even then he hadn't done it. They seemed like they were trustworthy enough, and they had a wagon. That would help cut down on their travel time by a lot. Crow looked uncertain, but after a beat he blew out through his lips. Fine, he said, looking back up at the other 3. But you'd better start talking once we leave. Of course. Reiji inclined his head. Then he turned off towards the rolling hills and put 2 fingers to his lips. He let out one pure note in a quick whistle. For a moment Yuya's ears only rang. And then over the crest of a nearby hill a horse appeared. The pure black stallion was lit briefly by the light of the sun, and Yuya's first thought was, is that a really close hill, or is that a really big horse? Then the horse cantered down the length of the hill, and Yuya realized that it was a really big horse. Yuya gasped, pressing back against Crow as the stallion approached. Yuya's head would only barely reach its chest, and its head was almost the length of Yuya's arm. Its powerful legs were twice the thickness of his own. Just one of those hooves could probably bash his skull in. Yuya darted behind Crow. He had never been around a lot of horses, but they didn't like him, and he knew that much. Crow put one arm back around Yuya. Hey, it's okay, he soothed. Animals don't like me, Yuya whispered. They know what I am. Reiji stepped forward and put his hand out. The horse put its nose right into Reiji's hand, waffling out once, ears flicking forward. I assure you, Armageddon holds you no ill will, Reiji said. Despite his name, he's soft-hearted. Still, Yuya decided he would keep his distance. He clung to Crow's back as Reiji put just one hand to the horse's neck and led it around the wagon, without any harness or reins. Tsukikage followed, disappearing around the front. Yuya waited until the horse was secured to the wagon before he let go of Crow's shirt. Sawatari spun around and beamed at Yuya then. "Well, let's go," he said, clapping his hands. "I actually have questions for you, too." For him? Well, at least Sawatari seemed excitable. Crow walked around the back of the wagon and clambered up, giving Yuya his hand to help him into it. Tsukikage sat in the driver's seat at the front, while Reiji climbed in through the front to sit on the crates. "Let's go," he said, and Tsukikage nodded. He tapped the lead on the harness lightly, and they started moving. The wagon clattered underneath them as they made their way over the grasses. Sawatari plopped himself down in the corner next to the pile of bags, swinging his lute over into his lap and laying his hands on it. He opened his mouth, but Reiji sent him a look and he closed it again. "Work on covering our tracks first," Reiji told him. "Fine." Sawatari scooched himself to the other end of the wagon, letting his legs dangle over the side. He strummed lightly on his lute and hummed low in his throat. Yuya gasped as he saw the wheel tracks behind them simply vanishing. Was that a blessing? Reiji's eyes moved to Crow and Yuya then. "So," he said, "your questions. As to who we are simply travelers looking for answers of our own." Crow snorted softly. Reiji just raised an eyebrow. "I came to Eclipse Scene looking to find more information," Reiji said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You might call me a scholar. I am studying the origin of the myth of the goddess and the demon. As the heart of the Arcanian religion, I thought Eclipse Scene might have more answers." He closed his eyes. "Unfortunately, we arrived the day the revolt occurred." Crow tensed, and Yuya felt his stomach twist. Phantom images of Jack Atlas bleeding out onto the ground flashed over his eyes, and he squeezed his eyes shut, hunching his shoulders around his ears. With the temple in something of a commotion, there was likely no chance of poking around asking questions of the priests. I would be regarded with suspicion, Reiji said. "You want to study the demon religion?" Crow said, his voice cracking. "You want to what? Hold interviews with the priests about it? What the hell for?" Reiji leveled his gaze at Crow, and Yui was struck just how calm and clear his eyes looked again. "You may have heard the phrase, 'know your enemy,'" he said. Those words rang for a few moments in the silence. Yuya looked down at his knees, not sure if he had the right or the ability to meet Reiji's eyes. He heard Reiji lean back again, and there was nothing for a moment but the sound of the wagon clattering over rocks and grass, Armageddon's heavy hooves plodding into the dirt. "I have my reasons for doing the research I do," he said. "I will leave it at that." "I thought you said you'd answer any of our questions," Crow challenged. Yuya glanced up to see Reiji simply blink. "And are you going to ask?" Crow opened his mouth, but Reiji's gaze was too powerful. Eventually, Crow closed his mouth. "Fine," he said. "Everyone needs their secrets, I guess. But answer this, then. How did you know what Yuya and I were doing?" Reiji closed his eyes, tilting his head. "I had a secondary objective in Eclipse Scene. I had hoped to make contact with the rebellion. There are some things in my own country that need to be addressed, and I wanted to find allies. I sent Tsukikage to find you, and he related back to me what happened with Yuya in your meeting." Crow froze. How? Oh, he wasn't in that room, Crow said. "I knew everyone in that room. How did you—" "Tsukikage is trained in arts that many people have forgotten," Reiji said. "Finding and hiding among you was not a problem for him." Reiji opened his eyes again. "And I was also at the solstice," he said. His eyes found Yuya's, and Yuya's breath caught. "I will be perfectly frank with you, Yuya. My initial plan was to kidnap you and use you as leverage against the priests." "Leverage for what?" Crow said. Reiji didn't answer him. He just held Yuya's gaze. Yuya felt like Reiji was looking for something there, but he wasn't sure what. "I don't like him," Yuri said. "Shut up," Yugo hissed. Yuya swallowed. And why didn't you?" Reiji blinked once. "Well, for one, I thought it was strange that a young man dressed in the clothing of a priest's servant was setting a very obvious fire trap in the alcohol tent," he said. And when you vanished, let's just say I decided it would be better to see how things played out." He straightened. "I will be upfront with you again, Yuya," he said. "My interest in you is not purely academic. I know what you are, and I know what you are supposed to become. I do not intend that to happen." Yuya nodded. He felt some kind of relief pour through him at those words. It confirmed one thing to him. Reiji didn't want him to last long enough to become a demon. And if he was really studying the demon and the goddess... "Does that mean... do you know a way to kill me?" Yuya said, his voice cracking with desperation. Reiji hesitated for a beat. Then he shook his head. "I do not," he said. "But I am doing what research I can about demon and goddess." His eyes slid back to Crow. "It is my understanding that you are headed to Korkoro in hopes of finding Raglan," he said. "I propose a deal." Crow's lips tightened, but he nodded, indicating that Reiji could continue. Reiji fixed his glasses on his face. "I have been looking for Raglan for a very long time myself. They have records about the goddess that I cannot find elsewhere, and perhaps allies that I can make contact with. I will escort you and Yuya to Kokoro, and then to Raglan, if only we can accompany you." "That's it?" Crow said. "Why do you want to find these records so badly?" Reiji's lips tightened, and Yuya thought he saw something pass over his face. I am not positive I can say, even if I wanted to," he said. "But this is what I have left, Crow Hogan. I am very close to the answers I seek, and I feel that Raglan may have them." Yuya heard only the tiniest movement of thought from Reiji then. It was barely a murmur, something Reiji himself was trying not to think or hear from himself. Yuya only got the impression of the thought, and it was self-hatred. Reiji hated himself, but didn't want to admit it. Did it have something to do with the reason he was looking for information about the goddess and the demon? Crow bit his lip. Then he glanced down at Yuya. "This is your journey," he said. "What do you want to do?" Yuya lifted his eyes. Reiji was waiting for an answer. Sawatari rocked back and forth too, eyes flickering between Reiji and Yuya. Even Tsukikage was glancing back over his shoulder, waiting. Yuya didn't sense any hatred from any of them. At least, not towards him. "Well?" he asked the other three. "I don't like it," Yuri said, right on cue. "But..." That was an unexpected response, and Yuya waited. "It's up to you," Yuto said quietly. "We'll always listen to what you want, Yuya." Yuya's hands tightened in his lap. Then he sucked in a breath. "Okay," he said. "I want to travel with them, Crow." Crow let out a large breath, as though he'd been holding it for a while, and Reiji's eyes closed with what might have been relief. "I am grateful, Yuya," he said. Yuya just nodded. He wasn't sure what he was feeling right now, but it wasn't a bad feeling. He got to make decisions himself, and it was odd. Sawatari bounced up in turn so that he was facing them again, looking like he was about to burst. "All right," he blurted, his face flushed with excitement. "Finally, a decision! This is a momentous first beginning to our intrepid party. I'll write a song about it." Tsukikage let out a coughing sound that might have been a laugh, and then Reiji sighed, a faint smile breaking over his lips as though Sawatari had just broken some horrible tension from him. Sawatari's bright eyes found Yuya's, and a huge grin spread over his face. He strummed his lute once and reached up to tune the knobs. "Now," he said, "might I have the pleasure of speaking with you, Emperor Yuya?" You can just call me Yuya," Yuya said. "Wonderful, and you can call me Shingo. We're practically friends already." Yuya felt a giggle escape him. Something about Sawatari's enthusiasm pulled immense weight off of Yuya's shoulders. "Might I ask you to tell me the story of your intrepid escape? There are many songs about you already, but I want to be the first to write the truth," Sawatari said. "After all, that's my duty as the world's greatest tale singer." "I've never heard of you before," Crow said, seeming as though he had just noticed Sawatari was even there. Sawatari drew himself up with a huff. "Well, now you have," he said. It was at such odds with the tension of the day that Yuya just had to laugh. And it was, he thought, The nicest feeling he had had in years. When was the last time he had ever laughed?